Be sure to follow my Twitch over at twitch.tv/Daltnix. Thank you. All right, hello everybody. In today's video, we're going to be ranking every single hunter exotic in a tier list. So I have 5 tiers here for you today. So the top of the tier list is meta. This will be the top of the picks, the best hunter exotics you have to offer for PvP. Then we go down to good, where the exotic is overall a good exotic. I would never hesitate when I look at somebody using it or question them for why they have it on. Definitely not the most meta exotic in the world, but it can definitely get the job done. Then we have It's Okay, where it's kind of a bit more of a niche pick and it can make a play, but it's not very often that it will get it. Maybe once a game, maybe twice a game for whatever it may be. Then Awful is just, you should never really use this exotic. It is terrible for PvP. And then finally, I have a 5th tier, which is good for 6s, because there are some exotics on here that are great for 6v6 game modes where there's a lot of chaos going around, where you can get a lot of kills or get multi-kills depending on the exotic. But if you use these sets exotics in like a 3v3 game mode, it wouldn't be that great. And for the most part, that is what this tier list is going to be based off. Whether you're playing Trials or Comp, one of the more competitive game modes, I'm going to be basing the exotic in that. But without further ado, let's get into it. We got 44 exotics here, I believe. So let's get on with it. So we have Aeons, and overall, not a bad exotic. Honestly, they are better in 6s, because if you don't know what Aeons do, if you pick the Sector of Vigor option, I believe, it will make it so you get a ton of class ability energy whenever your teammates die, and there's no range on this, which is fantastic. So honestly, it's really good for 6s, but when you get a revive, it also gives your class ability as well. So I think it's honestly not a bad pick for just normal 6v6 as well as 3v3 or comp, because you can get your class abilities a lot. So getting your dodge is pretty good, but for the most part, I feel like this exotic is really, really good on the Radiant Hunter build, so you can get your acrobatics dodge, because your other dodges you get back pretty quickly. So honestly, I'll put this one in good for 6s. I think the Aeons are better for the other classes, if I'm being honest. You get your dodge already so quick anyway, you don't really need it, unless if it's acrobatic dodge, but you're mostly running that to, 2-tap in 6s. Assassin's Cowl, what this does is it will make it so you go invisible and get health back whenever you get a melee kill. It's okay. It can do stuff, but there's a few certain builds that are okay with it, such as like Cryosthesia with throwing knives, but I'm just going to put it in the okay. It's not awful. It gets the job done, but there are definitely better exotics. So Aether's Embrace. Now, these things are really, really strong. So when you hit 3 precision headshots within 2.5 seconds of each other, you get a stronger knife, and this knife can one-shot body, and then the tracking on these things is insane. Normally, whenever I use these things or I play against them, they tend to make a big impact. I do want to, personally, I want to put them in meta, but I am just going to put them in good because it is a little bit map dependent. If you have a closer map, they will be a lot better. But if you're on a map such as like Vostok or something, you're only typically going to really get use out of them in the middle, like cave area. You can occasionally get people off guard with them depending on your bounce. But because it is so map dependent, I'm just going to put it in the good option. But this exotic is so much better than a lot of people give it credit for, and it is just stupid strong. All right, next up is Blight Ranger. Now, I forgot this exotic was even in the game. What this exotic does is make it so whenever you are blocking, it will not consume any extra super energy. I mean, I guess that's okay for your arc staff, and as well as the projectiles that are sent out of it will do 400% damage. That's kind of funny, I guess, but it's awful. I would never ever use this thing. If you see anybody using this thing, they're actually trolling. I don't even know if I've ever seen anybody use this in PvE or PvP. Next up is Caliban's Hand, and what this exotic does is it will make your proximity knife apply 60 Scorch on detonation, as well as proximity knife kills will cause the player to ignite. This exotic can make for a lot of crazy double multi-kills, whatever it may be, if enough people are stacked together, which means it is great for 6s. But in terms of Trials or Comp, you could make a play. I would say it's an okay pick, but for 6s, it is very, very strong. Next up, we have Celestial Nighthawk. This is typically a very meta PvE exotic, and I would just put it in the awful category. It makes your golden gun weaker. The only thing this really has going for it in PvP is you actually get extra super energy on headshot kills, which is okay, but not really worth wasting your exotic slot for. There's other exotics that can do what it does kind of better, but overall, pretty awful. Would never recommend using Celestial Nighthawk. Then we have Certarachne Facade. So what this exotic does is when you use your grapple ability, it will give you Woven Mail, and it will give you flinch reduction whenever you have Woven Mail. Honestly, a pretty good exotic. I would put it in the okay category. It's nothing super crazy. Woven Mail isn't the most game-changing like buff to have. It helps against like shotguns, infusion rifles, whatnot. But for the most part, if you're playing decent opponents, they're going to be hitting mostly hex shots anyway. It makes it so you can survive the grapple melee a lot, but for the most part, there's better exotics, but I could see why people would want to run this. Next up, we have Foes Tracer. This will give you a weapon damage bonus for an ability whenever you hit it. Overall, it's not a bad pick, honestly. I think it is either between the good and okay tier, because getting a weapon bonus for free whenever you hit ability isn't bad, but there's definitely easier ways to get weapon bonus. So I'm just going to put it in the okay tier. I don't think it's awful. It's not, you're not trolling by having this thing on, but definitely typically more of a PvE exotic, and it really depends on the weapons you're using. Next up, we have the Frosty 5, which anybody who's been following my channel for even a little bit knows I'm a Frosty enjoyer. I honestly think Frosties is one of the most underrated exotics in the entire game. I'm going to put it in the meta tier just because of how much ability spam you can have with this exotic. Running around is something you're typically going to be doing in PvP anyway, and it just buffs your cooldowns by so much. Giving 100% additional grenade and melee regeneration and 200% additional class ability energy is just insane for just running around doing something you're already supposed to be doing. Just stupidly strong. Honestly, any build is complemented with Frosties. Next up, we have Gemini Jesters. When you dodge, it will take away your opponent's radar. Overall, just a super solid pick. Against super coordinated teams, it might not be the greatest, but most teams, it's really going to mess them up if you hit them with a Gemini and then have your team push. Just super, super good for misleading the opponents and just messing them up, throwing them off their game. Next up is Graviton Forfeit. What this exotic does is it will increase your invisibility and make your melee last even longer, and it will also increase your recovery to 100, which is crazy good. Honestly, I think this is a super underrated invis exotic, and when invis was running rampant, this was my #1 exotic for solo trials back in the day, and I still think it's really, really good, in my honest opinion. If you really like to focus on invis, you get your smokes back very, very quickly, and overall, it's just a top pick, in my honest opinion. The only reason I wouldn't put it in the meta tier is just because invis isn't in the highest spot anymore, so it just goes into good. If you like using invis, I highly recommend you give it a try. It keeps the uptime of your invis and your smokes up really, really high, as well as not having to focus into recovery is a huge blessing in disguise for hunters. It makes it so you can build into mobility and resilience. So overall, just a top pick, honestly, just for that alone, getting that huge bump in recovery. Next up is Gifted Corvication. This is our new exotic for our Arc Strider. This makes it so whenever you use your Ascension or Tempest Strike, you will become amplified, as well as it will send out these little trackers, essentially just skip grenades. And if those skip grenades hit people, you'll get a damage resistance. The damage resistance isn't too noticeable. The big reason that you're going to be running this is to get the amplified on demand. Whenever you have your dodge, you just pop it, and then you can get amplified. Amplified is pretty good for getting a few buffs on the different subclass, but overall, this exotic is just kind of okay. I wouldn't say it's awful, depending on your build. Getting amplified at the beginning of like a trials round or a comp round could be pretty good because you can, run around really fast. The handling that you get from it is pretty good. But overall, I wouldn't say this thing is anything super game changing, but it can see a play depending on the build. Then next up is the Gwyzen Vest. This exotic will give you super energy back whenever you get a special blade kill. Overall, it's not the greatest. I would normally put it in awful, but it's good for 6s. If you switch to it when you get your super, if you care enough to do that, it can make your spectral blades last longer. But overall, I wouldn't really care too much for it. It's just not really that necessary, and spectral blades isn't the most meta. But if you switch to it, it's good for 6s. Then we have the G Falcon Halbert. This will give you volatile rounds whenever you exit invisibility, and it's okay. It's not the greatest exotic in the world. The only time I would ever really use this is if you're using Stylus Executioner and you can use it to go invisible, but for the most part, I'd put it in the pretty bad tier. It's okay for one specific build, and even then, it's not the greatest. So I just put it in the awful. I wouldn't really use it. There's definitely a lot better builds, especially with Prismatic Hunter being in the game now. Then we have Caprice Sting. This will increase your smoke damage by 50%, as well as making the smoke when it hits somebody give you True Sight, which is okay. Caprice Sting isn't bad. I'll put it in the okay tier. The increased smoke damage has a play if you play it on Prismatic Hunter. If you grapple melee somebody, it can actually one-shot them with the smoke, which will also give you some True Sight. I plan on probably making a build on the channel at some point with that just to try it out. But for the most part, it's just kind of a whatever exotic. It can get the job done, but there's definitely better out there. Speaking of better, we're on to our Knucklehead Radar, which is one of the best exotics in the game. We're going to put this in the meta tier. Knucklehead gives you so many just wonderful bonuses. Knucklehead will, one, make it so you'll have your radar whenever you aim down sights, which is super good. It'll make it so you have increased damage when your opponent is under 30% HP. Not a huge increase to damage, but still a little bit, depending on what weapon you're using. As well as always, you'll occasionally get wall hacks whenever you hit an enemy. You will mark them and you can see them through walls. It will also give you increased airborne effectiveness. Just overall, just a super good exotic. If you just want to put an exotic on and not really think and get passive bonuses, Knucklehead Radar is the perfect one. You don't need to think about anything. Put it on, have a good time. Then we have Liar's Handshake. This will make it so whenever you hit somebody, the second melee will have a super punch that can one punch, or if somebody punches you, you can punch them back with a one punch. It's very situational. I'll put it in the okay tier. I'd be leaning to more so awful, but like it's not as bad as these ones, so we'll put it in like okay. It can see play, but the higher the skill bracket you get, the less this is really going to come into play, because most of the time in higher skill brackets, people will just shotgun melee you, and you'll either die to the shotgun or die to the melee, so you won't really have time. It's only really good if somebody double melees you, which most people aren't typically doing in higher skill level lobbies, but it can come into play occasionally. Lucky Pants next up on the list. Obviously, this is our hand cannon exotic. This will make your handling on all hand cannons feel amazing, as well as have the accuracy bonus that makes hand cannons have a massive hitbox, even more than they already do. Honestly, a pretty good exotic if you enjoy hand cannons, but obviously if you're not using a hand cannon, it's pretty worthless. But I want to put it in the good tier, but I don't necessarily think it belongs there. But I'm gonna put it there. We're gonna put it in the good tier. I think it is good for if you are a hand cannon enjoyer. It buffs up hand cannons. It makes them feel really, really good. And then you essentially get quick draw on like steroids with it. It's a really strong exotic if you enjoy hand cannons. Then we have Lucky Raspberry. This increases the chaining capabilities of your arc bolt, as well as will give you grenade energy back whenever you hit somebody with a jolt. And then Ionic Traces will also give you an additional 5% to your arc bolt regeneration, which is okay, but it's pretty bad. I would never really use Lucky Raspberry. It's just not really worth it. Arc bolts are a pretty good grenade, and they don't really need the extra chaining capabilities and getting them back a little bit quicker. There's just exotics that do that way better, such as Frosties. There's not really a point to do that where you need to jolt a target to get the increased regen or get arc bolts back when you can just run and pretty much get it back already. So next up is Mask of Bacchus. Now this is an interesting one. I think Mask of Bacchus is a top tier exotic, if I'm being honest with you. I think it's meta. The only downside to it is after you do your shift teleport, it will make it so your dodge will be on a little bit of a longer cooldown while the damage buff is going. But it's pretty hard to argue with an exotic that makes it so your dodge goes really far. It obviously, depending on the subclass you're running, it will make it so it slows, and you can drop a clone on Prismatic. It gives you a damage buff. It pretty much makes it so you'll win any 1v1 fight when an opponent gets close to you. Just a very, very strong pick. Next up, we have Mechanier's Trick Sleeves. This is our sidearm exotic. Now, this will buff your sidearms to just be crazy. I think Mechanier Trick Sleeve is a good one. It's very similar to Lucky Pants, but honestly, probably better for sidearms than Lucky Pants is for hand cannons. You can get some damage bonuses to make your sidearms kill even quicker, and it just makes sidearms feel amazing. Definitely a very good exotic if you like sidearms. Then we have Moth Keepers. This is an okay exotic. I was really hoping better for it when it first released. It can get the job done. It can get some blinds, get you some shields, but overall, it's nothing super crazy for PvP. It can be very fun, but I would not really recommend if you're trying to go flawless to put on the Moth Keepers. Then we have Oath Keepers, which I will put them in the good tier. Again, if you're a bow user, Oath Keepers are good. I feel like most of these exotics that will be focused on the gun or weapon that you want to use are going to be in the good tier, just because they just buff up the weapon so nicely. Then we have Omnioculist, which this is a meta. It's super, super strong. Obviously, it got nerfed a while ago, but like it's still really good. You can have constant time on your invisibility. The damage reduction is still really good. The extra smoke, it's just a perfect exotic if you want to play Night Stalker Hunter. Ophidius Spades, this will give you an extra knife, as well as increase your knife damage as you get kills with them. It's good for 6s. I would never use it anywhere else, but it can be good for 6s if you like throwing knives. Then we got Orpheus Rigs, top tier in PvE, awful in PvP. Don't use it. just don't. Then we have Radiant Flux. This will buff up your Arc Staff. It's awful. Just don't use it. It can make your super last a very long time, but Arc Staff isn't the most meta, so I wouldn't bother with it. Especially with the new Arc Hunter super in the game, there's no reason to use Arc Staff. Wouldn't use this thing. Then there's Raiju Harness, which will make it so your Arc Staff doesn't drain as quickly, as well as you can deactivate your Arc Staff to conserve some of your super energy, and when you do this, it will also make a blinding explosion, and then it will also give you a nice 4x weapon surge bonus for 16 seconds. Not really worth it. Again, Arc Staff is kind of a whatever pick, so we're just going to put this down in the awful. At one point, it made your Arc Staff last like 40 seconds or something, and it was like god tier, but they have nerfed that a while ago, so it's pretty bad. I would not recommend running Raiju's Harness. Now, Radiance Dance Machine's actually not a bad pick. Whenever you dodge near somebody, you can just spam dodges after that. If you're close enough, you can get a bunch of melees, and overall, it's just honestly a super okay pick. It's not super crazy, but it also has some play, and I honestly think it is a bit better than a lot of people give it credit for, and can be for some pretty silly plays as well, if I'm going to be honest. I've used this one in a fair amount in PvP, and it's definitely a very fun exotic to use. If you're just looking for some new exotic to pick up to try a new build with, I really do recommend trying Radiant Dance Machines. Then we got Renewal Grasp. This makes it so when you stand inside your dust field, you'll get frost armor for every second that you're in there. Great for damage reduction. It's just in PvP, standing in a dust field for 8 seconds to try to get as much frost armor as you can is definitely not the most beneficial thing to spend your time. Now, it will also make your dust fields a bit bigger, which so it can buff them up a decent amount. So I'll put this one in the good tier. It is nothing stupidly crazy, but it's also not the most useless exotic. Honestly, I would use this one more so for the increased size of your dust field than the frost armor. I honestly think I prefer this one prior to the fact in terms of PvP anyway, where you got the damage reduction right away, where you didn't really need to chill out in the snow globe to get it, but I still think it is a very good pick. Then we got the Kara's Grasp, and this is just a terrible exotic. Never use it. Probably one of the worst exotics in the game. Once you hit a melee, it gives you increased airborne effectiveness, which isn't bad, as well as jump height and mobility, but it's only for 5 seconds, so it's just not really worth it when other exotics kind of just do what it does, but better. Now, next up is Shards of Galanor, which this will refund super energy on Blade Barrage hits, which is super good, but then it will also give you a good chunk of super energy on throwing knife kills. Now, normally, most people would probably assume I'm going to put it in the awful, but I'm actually going to put it in good for 6v6 because there are certain builds that you can do that make it so you can get a ton of supers in a game. And it is honestly a ball of a time to use in 6v6 if you enjoy throwing knives. You can get to the point where you can get 4, 5, even 6 supers if you get enough throwing knife kills and hit enough people with your Blade Barrage. Very strong for 6s in my honest opinion. Terrible for 3v3, but good for 6s. Shinobu's Vows just grants you an extra skip grenade charge, and it makes them a bit more aggressive, but skip grenades are terrible, so awful. If skip grenades ever get a buff, cool, they can go in there, but overall just really, really bad. All right, Speedloader Slacks. I think this is a really good exotic. Gets you extra airborne effectiveness, gets you some handling, gets you some reload. Overall, just a really top pick. I love running them. The way that they feel and the way they buff up your guns is just super, super good. I wouldn't say they're the most meta by any means, but definitely a treat to use. I love using Speedloaders, and yeah, not really much to say. They're good. I would never second guess anybody who would be running Speedloaders. Now we have Stompies, the Stompies. This exotic has been the bane for a lot of people in the Crucible, but I am just going to put it in good. I don't think it's the most OP thing in the world. It doesn't do anything that makes it so you just like can easily click a button and outplay somebody. It just makes it so you move around faster and you jump quicker, which is great. Most players will take that. Most skilled players will take any extra movement to their kit. That's just what most people do, but it doesn't do anything crazy outlandish like these ones. Like, it doesn't give you wall hacks. It doesn't make it so you have all your abilities up every 30 seconds. It doesn't teleport and make you just instantly win a 1v1. It doesn't have constant invis for your entire team. It just makes you jump a little bit better. So it's a really good pick. I'd put it probably like higher in the good tier, but it is definitely not like the most meta pick by any means. All right, then we got Star Eaters, which Star Eaters are awful. The only thing that they can really give for you in PvP that would really matter is the increased super damage is okay, but the extra ability energy from orbs isn't bad, but I would never really consider to run them. Bombardiers, we're going to put this in the okay tier. It's nothing super crazy. dodging makes a little bomb. Depending on the build you're running, it's not bad, but most of the builds that would really utilize this don't really need it, if I'm being honest with you, for it to get the full effectiveness out of it. But it can make do and definitely get the job done, and you can get an occasional kill here and there with them, so definitely not bad. Then we have Dragon Shadow, which it pains me because I kind of just want to put Dragon Shadow in the okay. I love Dragon Shadow. It's one of my favorite exotics, but due to the dodge cooldowns just being as long as they are now, not that they're that long, but at one point you could always have the Dragon Shadow buff going. The Dragon Shadow buff would last 9 to 10 seconds, and then your dodge was also on 9 to 10 seconds, so you could just spam it constantly. But the fact that you only have the buff up like half of the time makes it kind of just like not as good. I still think it's a good exotic. It's just not as good as something like speed loaders, even if the handling bonus is better. I think on something like the exotic class item where you can get like 2 dodges with 6 at Coyote, it's not bad, but I'm just going to put it in the okay tier for now. I wish Bungie would buff the duration of this one just by a little bit to make up for the dodge cooldowns. Then speaking of, 6 Coyote gives you double dodge. Great for certain builds such as this Threaded Spectre build. Everything else is kind of just whatever, so just going to put it in the okay tier. Because just because it's good, really good for one build doesn't mean it's the most practical exotic for a neutral game exotic. Like obviously when we're talking about certain exotics that are based on certain like subclasses, obviously it's only going to be for one build, but seeing as this is a neutral game exotic, it's kind of whatever unless if you use, again, the Threaded Spectre build, but even then there's just better exotics for that build now, if I'm being honest. Then we got Trident Vice, which is our glaive exotic, which honestly, it doesn't really buff off the glaives enough to really warrant. So I'm just going to put it in the awful tier because you can use a glaive without its exotic, and it would feel very similar to a glaive with this exotic, which if you're using an exotic for a certain weapon, such as Lucky Pants, Trick Sleeves, or Oath Keepers, it should really be buffing up your weapon a lot more, where this doesn't really do that much for you. It will increase the glaive melee damage, which is okay. It doesn't really matter for PvP. And it will make the glaive projectile do a little extra damage because it will explode, but it's not the greatest. I would not recommend these even if you're a glaive user. Then we got Worm Husk, which will give you health back whenever you dodge, which is super strong. We're going to put it in the meta. Pretty much just a get out of jail free card. Not quite, because you can, still die with it, but getting a good chunk of health, getting 67 HP from a dodge is very, very strong. Then we have Young Ankara's Spines, which this will buff up your trip mines, which this got nerfed a while ago, but it is still very, very good. I'm really surprised more people don't use this. Trip mines are still fantastic. The range of this is still really, really good. The damage is super strong. It's just obviously the trip mines get destroyed a lot easier now and don't give you an entire grenade pack, but they're still really, really good. Then we have the new exotic Balance of Power, and this will make it so your Threaded Spectre has 2 more threadlings and will take you off the radar. I think this is honestly a good exotic. Not really much bad to say about it. You don't notice the radar manipulation going into play too much just because it's a little hard to see how much it messes with your opponents, but the fair amount that I've used it, it feels really, really good, and I've enjoyed using it, so no real complaints on this one. I could see maybe making an argument for just saying it's okay, but I personally think it's good, so I'm just going to put it there. And then for our class exotic, because you get so many different perks on this, I'm just going to put this in S tier just because there are so many good things you can get. And just the fact alone that it can get Ophidian aspects from Warlocks just already makes it good. And then, but like I said, you can also get like Dragon Shadow with 6 Coyote. You can get so many good things. So we're just going to put it in the S tier. I'm not going to go over every single one that you can get. So this is my Hunter tier list. Overall, if you're using any one of these at the top, I wouldn't question you for it. They're all really, really good in their own rights. And these ones are not necessarily bad. It's just they require certain builds to really, get a feel for it. And then these ones I would just never recommend using for PvP. It's just not worth it, as I said. Let me know how you feel about the list. Let me know down in the comments. I'm sure I'm going to be told how stupid I am for putting your favorite exotic in a lower tier. But thank you guys so much and have a good rest of your day.